Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into an aspect of Viking life you might not expect: their hygiene. We all know them as fierce warriors and skilled seafarers, but when it comes to cleanliness, the Vikings weren't exactly ahead of their time. In fact, their hygiene habits were pretty shocking compared to what we're used to today. So sit back and grab your favorite snack as we explore Viking hygiene, or the lack thereof. When we think of Vikings, the image that immediately comes to mind is often that of fierce, rugged warriors. They are depicted with long flowing hair, thick beards, and a fearsome presence on the battlefield. From TV shows like Vikings to popular movies like Thor, Vikings have become iconic symbols of strength, bravery, and exploration. They're often portrayed as larger than life figures who sailed the seas, raided distant lands, and established kingdoms that lasted centuries. But as we dive deeper into the lives of these fascinating historical figures, there's one aspect that often gets overlooked: their hygiene. While these warriors may have looked cool and intimidating on the outside, their approach to personal cleanliness was far from what we would consider acceptable by modern standards. In fact, when you compare Viking hygiene to today's norms, where daily showers, deodorants, and regular dental checkups are the standard, it's safe to say that Vikings didn't have the best track record when it came to keeping themselves clean. So, how did they manage to maintain their appearance and hygiene with such a lack of modern conveniences? Let's break it down and explore exactly what they did when it came to personal care. First, it's important to remember that the Vikings lived over 1,000 years ago, from the 8th to the 11th century, during a time when hygiene practices were vastly different from today. People didn't have running water, indoor plumbing, or modern sanitation systems like we have now. Bathing wasn't as simple as stepping into a warm shower in the comfort of your own bathroom. In fact, many people throughout medieval Europe, including the Vikings, had much more rudimentary methods of staying clean, if they cared about cleanliness at all. During this period, personal hygiene was less about vanity and more about survival. Vikings were warriors, explorers, and farmers. Their focus was on staying alive, finding food, and protecting their families. While some societies put a greater emphasis on cleanliness and grooming, the Vikings were primarily concerned with battle, raids, and expansion. Bathing, grooming, and personal cleanliness simply weren't top priorities in their world. That said, Vikings were far from filthy by the standards of their time. They did have some methods of keeping clean, but they certainly didn't have the luxury of modern hygiene products, practices, or technology. So, let's take a closer look at how they handled their hygiene, or in many cases, the lack thereof. When you think of hygiene, the first thing that comes to mind for most people is probably bathing. So, how did the Vikings manage when it came to washing themselves? Interestingly, Vikings were known to bathe more often than many other people in medieval Europe. In fact, it's said that the Vikings were actually quite ahead of their time in this regard. While many cultures during the medieval period went without baths for extended periods, the Vikings reportedly bathed once a week, and sometimes even more frequently, depending on the weather and their situation. However, there's a catch. Viking bathing wasn't like the long, relaxing showers or bubble baths we take today. For the Vikings, bathing was a much more basic and communal affair. Vikings primarily bathed in public steam baths, where they would sweat it out in hot, steamy rooms. These steam baths were popular across the Scandinavian region and were likely shared by entire villages. They were communal spaces where people would gather, sweat, and cleanse themselves. Sounds pretty close to a spa day, right? Well, not quite. The problem with these steam baths was that they didn't have the modern plumbing or sanitation systems that we rely on today. They were essentially just rooms filled with hot, damp air. While the heat would make you sweat and help rinse off some dirt, the reality was that there wasn't much in the way of actual cleaning going on. The Vikings didn't have soap, as we know it today, which meant that while they were bathing in hot steam, they were probably not washing off all the grime, oil, and bacteria that naturally accumulated on their bodies. To make matters worse, these baths were often used by entire communities, meaning that the same water and steam would be shared by many people. While Vikings were certainly more hygienic than their contemporaries, who rarely bathed, their approach to cleanliness was far from ideal. It's safe to say that their steam baths were more about relaxation and socializing than actual sanitation. If you've ever seen depictions of Vikings, whether in movies, TV shows, or historical illustrations, you probably noticed their long wild hair and thick braided beards. These hair features are a big part of the Viking image, and for many it's hard to imagine a Viking without his signature look. But what did Vikings do to maintain their hair and beard? Well, despite the fact that they didn't have modern hair care products, the Vikings did care about grooming, even if it wasn't as sophisticated as what we have today. Vikings used simple tools like combs made from wood or bone to keep their hair and beards from getting too tangled. These combs were often finely crafted and could even be decorated with intricate designs, showcasing the Vikings' craftsmanship. While they may have had basic tools for combing their hair, there were a few issues with keeping their hair clean. For one, Vikings didn't have shampoos, conditioners, or other hair care products to cleanse and nourish their locks. This meant that their hair likely accumulated dirt, oil, and sweat, especially during long voyages or battles. Another factor that made Viking hair maintenance tricky was the fact that they didn't have access to regular washing facilities. Long sea voyages, campaigns, and raids meant that they couldn't always get to a clean source of water. As a result, even if they had combs to help detangle their hair, they didn't have the luxury of washing their hair frequently. Their long hair and beards likely became home to dirt, salt from the sea, and unfortunately, lice. Imagine having to deal with that while also being a feared warrior. When it comes to personal hygiene today, many of us can't imagine going a day without brushing our teeth. In fact, it's one of the most basic forms of self-care we practice every morning and night. But for the Vikings, brushing their teeth was not a part of their daily routine because they didn't have toothbrushes or toothpaste. Viking dental care was extremely basic and largely ineffective by today's standards. Instead of modern toothbrushes, Vikings sometimes used twigs from certain trees as makeshift toothpicks to clean between their teeth. While these twigs may have helped remove some food particles, they did little to combat plaque, tartar, or tooth decay. The Vikings didn't have fluoride, toothpaste, or any kind of professional dental treatment, so their teeth likely suffered as a result. Many Vikings probably had teeth that were worn down from a diet consisting of coarse grains, salted meats, and other tough foods. Without proper dental hygiene, cavities, gum disease, and tooth loss would have been common problems. The lack of modern dental care tools likely led to early tooth decay, making their smiles a bit less charming than the clean white teeth we see today. So, if you ever wondered why Viking warriors looked so fierce with their toothy grins, it might be because their teeth were often in pretty rough shape. Now, let's talk about something that's often considered a major hygiene issue in today's world: body odor. In modern society, most of us rely on deodorants or antiperspirants to keep ourselves smelling fresh, whether it's a quick spray of cologne or a swipe of deodorant. We have an array of products to help us stay odor free throughout the day. But for the Vikings, body odor wasn't something they could easily mask or control. Without deodorants or antiperspirants, the Vikings likely smelled pretty bad, especially after long days of sailing, fighting, or farming. After all, without regular bathing and with the harsh conditions they faced, it would have been nearly impossible to avoid body odor. In fact, it's believed that the Vikings might have used herbs, flowers, or oils to try to mask their scent. While this might have helped a little, it's highly unlikely that it would have been enough to cover up the stench of sweat, dirt, and the salty sea air that clung to their skin. In communal living spaces, the smells of body odor, sweat, and livestock would have been quite overpowering. Keep in mind that many Vikings lived in small, crowded homes, sometimes sharing space with animals. The lack of proper sanitation, combined with long periods of time spent without washing, meant that personal cleanliness was often put on the back burner. As you can imagine, the harsh realities of Viking life didn't leave much room for personal hygiene. These were warriors and explorers, not people who had the time or energy to focus on grooming themselves. Their primary concern was survival, fighting, raiding, and farming. Being clean wasn't necessarily a top priority. Living in small, poorly ventilated homes, Vikings had little access to fresh water for bathing or washing. With no running water or indoor plumbing, staying clean was a difficult task. In fact, many Viking settlements were located in remote areas where access to clean water was limited. This meant that regular bathing was a luxury that they couldn't always afford. When compared to other cultures of the time, the Vikings were somewhat more hygienic. In many parts of medieval Europe, people didn't bathe at all, or did so very infrequently. The Vikings, by contrast, bathed at least once a week, which was far more frequent than most of their contemporaries. However, when you compare Viking hygiene to that of the ancient Romans, the Vikings fall short. The Romans had a highly developed system of public baths and were known for their obsession with cleanliness. Despite this, it's important to remember that the Vikings were working with limited resources and didn't have the modern conveniences that we take for granted today. So, while their hygiene may not have been up to modern standards, they did the best they could with what they had. In the end, it's clear that while Vikings may have been fearsome warriors, they weren't exactly known for their personal hygiene. With limited resources, no running water, and no access to the hygiene products we use today, keeping clean was a challenge for these tough warriors. Despite this, they managed to stay relatively clean compared to many of their contemporaries, thanks to their steam baths and other basic grooming practices. So the next time you think of Vikings as larger-than-life heroes, remember that behind those fierce looks and strong warriors, they were dealing with the same hygiene challenges that many ancient cultures faced. They may have been warriors of the sea, but they were far from being the cleanest people around. First off, let's talk about bathing. Believe it or not, the Vikings did bathe more often than many of their European neighbors. But before you get too excited, their idea of a bath wasn't quite what we think of today. Vikings didn't have showers or bathtubs like we do now. In fact, the modern day concept of stepping into a warm, soothing shower or having a relaxing bubble bath was nowhere near what the Vikings experienced. While many people across Europe during the Viking Age were skipping baths entirely for extended periods, the Vikings did make an effort to bathe at least once a week, which might sound pretty good at first. However, there's a catch. Their bathing methods were a lot more basic and primitive than we might imagine. The Viking idea of bathing revolved around what we would recognize today as a steam bath or sauna. This type of bath involved sitting in hot, steamy rooms where the heat would make people sweat and help remove dirt from the skin. While this certainly had some health benefits, it's far from the cleansing experience that we now associate with personal hygiene. In fact, when you think about a bath today, it's not just about sweating out impurities, but also about washing off grime with soap and water, followed by the option of using scrubs, exfoliants, and other products that enhance the experience. However, the Vikings didn't have access to modern soaps, oils, or shampoos, and their cleaning routines lacked the detailed process that we take for granted. The steam baths the Vikings used were communal. Picture a room filled with people, sweating and sitting together in the heat. While this may sound like it could be a relaxing social event, it likely wasn't as refreshing as our own trips to the spa or sauna. The communal nature of these baths meant that several people would share the same space, sometimes in close quarters for long periods. The more people using the space, the more crowded and sweaty it would become, and there was no modern ventilation or airflow to help refresh the air. In fact, in a typical Viking bathhouse, the room would likely become a hot, humid, and often very smelly environment. These communal baths were often far from hygienic by today's standards. The steam and heat might help to open pores and induce sweating, but it didn't do much to actually clean the skin in the way that we might expect. Without soap, there was no way to break down oils or grime, which would have built up over time. While the steam might have helped remove some dirt, it wouldn't have provided the same cleansing effect we get from bathing with soap and warm water. It was likely that many Vikings left the bath with as much dirt on their skin as when they arrived, or at best only partially cleaned off. On top of that, Viking bathhouses didn't have the same kind of cleanliness we would associate with modern public spaces. Imagine using a public shower today, where you expect the floor to be cleaned regularly, the water to be fresh, and the air to be relatively free from unpleasant odors. Now, picture a Viking bathhouse without any of these conveniences. The rooms were often used by large groups of people and weren't regularly cleaned. There were no regulations or staff to ensure that the bath was hygienic or safe, so it's likely that over time, these spaces became quite grimy. Dirt and sweat would accumulate on the floors, and over time the bathhouses might have had a somewhat unpleasant odor, adding to the uncomfortable experience. In a place where people would bathe together, there was no real way to avoid this buildup of grime, and the absence of soap or cleaning products meant that the water itself likely became dirty fairly quickly. Another major issue with the Viking steam baths was the lack of proper water sanitation. Today, we take for granted the fact that our water is filtered, cleaned, and treated to remove bacteria, chemicals, and other impurities. But the Vikings didn't have modern plumbing or water filtration systems. They used water that was sourced from rivers, lakes, or wells, and the quality of that water could vary greatly depending on the location. Not only was the water used for bathing not sterilized, but the Vikings likely didn't have any means of ensuring it stayed clean. As a result, water in their baths could easily become contaminated, either from dirt being washed off their bodies, from the sweat of others, or even from waste that might have inadvertently made its way into the bath water. All of this combined with the absence of soap meant that Viking bathing practices weren't very effective in terms of actual cleanliness. This brings us to another key point: soap. While the Vikings were adept at many things, they didn't have the luxury of soap as we know it today. They used simple, natural oils and herbs for various purposes, but when it came to cleaning their skin, these were far from the cleansing products we use now. They might have used some kind of natural ash or other abrasive materials to help scrub their bodies, but this wouldn't have had the same gentle effect as modern soap, which is formulated to break down oils and wash away dirt efficiently. Without the luxury of soap, Vikings had to rely on other ways to keep their skin clean, but these methods were far from perfect. Many people in Viking society had access to rudimentary grooming tools like combs made from bone, wood, or antler, which they used to manage their hair. While this might have helped with hair maintenance, it didn't do much for the cleanliness of the skin. And although the Vikings likely washed their faces in streams or rivers, this wouldn't have been a regular or thorough cleaning process, especially given the cold temperatures of Scandinavia and the challenges involved in gathering enough fresh water for personal hygiene. They also didn't have deodorants to combat body odor, meaning that after a long day of hard work or battle, the Vikings were likely to have developed a strong smell of sweat, dirt, and musk. Even though they may have used herbs or other natural fragrances to mask their body odor, it's safe to say that the Viking scent wasn't one of freshness, but of raw nature and battle readiness. Interestingly, despite these challenges, Vikings took their hygiene more seriously than many other cultures at the time. While most Europeans were avoiding baths altogether, especially during the medieval period, the Vikings were known to bathe regularly. They even had a saying, "A clean man is a healthy man." In fact, Vikings reportedly bathed once a week or more, depending on the climate and their daily activities. While this is a far cry from modern bathing habits, especially in a world where daily showers and meticulous skincare routines are standard, the Vikings' bathing practices were progressive compared to many of their contemporaries. The Vikings also valued their appearance in other ways. They were known for their attention to personal grooming, especially when it came to their beards and hair. While their methods may have been less sophisticated than what we're used to today, the Vikings did take care to comb their hair and beards with special combs made from wood, bone, or ivory. These combs were intricately designed and were often highly prized possessions. Vikings cared about how they looked and knew the importance of maintaining their grooming, even if they didn't have the same resources we do. For example, while they didn't have shampoos or conditioners, they likely used natural oils and water to keep their hair looking presentable, at least to the best of their ability. But when it comes to their overall cleanliness, the Viking lifestyle was inherently challenging. Living in harsh, cold climates with limited access to fresh water made it difficult to maintain the kind of hygienic standards we've grown accustomed to in modern society. Their homes were often small, crowded, and shared with livestock, and they didn't have the luxury of modern plumbing or sanitation systems. This meant that the Vikings' idea of hygiene was focused more on survival and practicality rather than luxury or comfort. It's important to remember that their lives were defined by battle, exploration, and survival, and personal cleanliness simply wasn't the top priority. When it comes to Viking bathing, the absence of soap, regular washing routines, and proper sanitation meant that even though they made an effort to bathe, they were still falling short of modern expectations. Their steam baths, while better than nothing, were not sufficient for thoroughly cleaning the body. These communal bathing spaces could get dirty and were likely filled with germs and bacteria, making the experience far from refreshing. The water wasn't filtered, the air was heavy with the scent of sweat, and the absence of soap made it impossible to get rid of all the dirt and grime. Ultimately, the Viking bathing experience was less about true cleanliness and more about getting rid of the worst of the dirt and having a communal space to relax and refresh, if not entirely cleanse. So while the Vikings did bathe more often than many of their European neighbors, their methods were far from the luxurious or hygienic practices we take for granted today. Their bathing routines, though progressive for their time, were limited by the lack of modern conveniences, making it clear that Vikings, while tough and fierce, had hygiene habits that would make us cringe today. Their steam baths, communal spaces, and lack of soap meant that they didn't truly get clean in the way we do. But in the end, cleanliness wasn't their top priority. Survival, exploration, and battle came first. And considering the rough lives they led, it's safe to say they did the best they could with what they had. Now you might be thinking, well, they had steam baths. That must have been great. But here's the catch. While they were definitely more hygienic than not bathing at all, these baths weren't sanitized. Without proper cleaning and soap, they were essentially just hot rooms filled with sweat and dirt. In fact, even though the Vikings are often praised for their relatively frequent bathing habits compared to their European neighbors, their approach to personal hygiene still had its limitations, especially by modern standards. So while the Vikings may have bathed more frequently than some cultures at the time, their hygiene was still pretty lacking, particularly when compared to today's standards, where we expect cleanliness, sterilization, and regular access to soap and water. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of modern plumbing or cleaning systems, unlike today, where we have hot water on demand and showers that rinse away the dirt. The Vikings relied on steam baths that had their own set of challenges. These steam baths were communal, meaning they were shared spaces where multiple people would bathe together, often in the same room. While the communal nature of these baths could have served as a social gathering point, it also created an environment where cleanliness was hard to maintain. The air would quickly become thick with steam, sweat, and body odor, and while the heat was great for sweating out impurities, it didn't exactly scrub away the grime. Unlike modern saunas or spas, which are often meticulously maintained and cleaned, Viking bathhouses would have lacked proper sanitation protocols. These spaces were not sterilized between uses, and because they didn't have soap, there was no way to break down oils, dirt, and bacteria that would naturally build up, while sweat and heat may have helped to open pores and release some of the grime. It wasn't the same as the deep cleaning we get from soap and water. So instead of feeling clean and refreshed, the Vikings probably left these steam rooms still feeling somewhat grimy, especially after long voyages or busy days of farming and battle. Without any real way to wash off the dirt and oils from their bodies, the bathhouse was more of a ritualistic cleansing than a true hygiene solution. Additionally, Viking bathhouses didn't benefit from modern conveniences like drainage systems or water filtration. The water used in these baths often came from rivers, lakes, or wells, and without any kind of water treatment, it was far from clean. River water, for example, could be contaminated with all kinds of bacteria, dirt, and possibly even waste. When multiple people used the same bathwater, the situation was compounded. Imagine a room filled with people, all sweating and rinsing off, without any way to ensure the water was free from contaminants. The lack of proper water sanitation meant that Viking bathhouses could easily become a breeding ground for bacteria, which would defeat the purpose of bathing altogether. And what about soap? The Vikings didn't have the luxury of the fancy, fragrant soaps that we use today to cleanse our skin. While soap has been around for thousands of years, it wasn't readily available to the Vikings. They didn't have access to the kinds of chemical and scented products that we use to wash away the oils and grime that accumulate on our bodies. The Vikings might have used some form of primitive soap made from animal fats and ash, but this would have been very basic compared to the liquid soaps and body washes we rely on today. Without soap, their attempts at bathing were limited to simply sitting in hot water and letting the sweat and steam do the work of cleaning their bodies. While the Vikings may have occasionally used natural oils, herbs, or fragrances to mask body odor, they didn't have the sophisticated cleansing products we now use to ensure our hygiene is up to modern standards. The communal nature of Viking steam baths also posed another hygiene issue. Sharing space with many people in a small hot room filled with steam, everyone would have been exposed to the same conditions, making it difficult to avoid the smells, sweat, and body oils of others. In modern spas or saunas, we have separate stalls, showers, and strict rules for hygiene that make sure each person has a clean, private experience. The Vikings, however, had to make do with what they had. Bathing together in a group meant that bacteria, sweat, and odors would likely be transferred between individuals, further compromising the effectiveness of the bath. When a large group of people shares the same small heated space, it becomes nearly impossible to ensure cleanliness, especially when the water itself isn't changed between uses. Even though Viking bathhouses were probably more hygienic than many other places in medieval Europe, where public baths were often avoided or abandoned altogether, they still faced significant challenges. The idea of a clean bath for the Vikings was a far cry from what we consider clean today. Their bodies may have been less grimy than those of other European peoples who didn't bathe at all, but their version of cleanliness was still far from perfect. Even the frequency of Viking bathing, which was reported to be once a week or more, didn't guarantee that they were getting rid of all the oils, dirt, or bacteria that accumulated on their bodies. The Vikings may have bathed more often than their peers, but the fact remains that their bathing rituals were not particularly effective at getting them truly clean. When you think about it, the lack of access to soap or any kind of modern cleaning agents really hindered the Vikings' ability to maintain hygiene in the way we do today. Soap is a fundamental part of modern hygiene because it helps break down oils and dirt on the skin, making it easier to wash them away with water. Without this simple yet essential tool, the Vikings were left with basic methods that didn't truly clean their skin. Even though they used steam and sweat as a way to cleanse their bodies, it's not the same as thoroughly scrubbing away all the contaminants that build up over time. In addition, the lack of modern plumbing meant that Viking homes and bathhouses didn't have running water that could be replaced easily. When they bathed, they had to rely on natural sources of water, which could be contaminated, and they didn't have a system to drain or filter out dirty water after use. In fact, many Viking homes were built in close proximity to animals and livestock, and without the sanitation systems that we rely on today, the risk of contamination was high. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of indoor plumbing or septic systems, so managing waste and maintaining clean water supplies was an ongoing challenge. Bathing in water that wasn't properly filtered or cleaned could lead to a variety of health issues, especially in a time before antibiotics and modern medicine. Let's also not forget that Viking society placed a great emphasis on their image. They were warriors, explorers, and traders, and personal appearance played a role in how they were perceived by others. Vikings were known for their long, flowing hair and thick braided beards, and these features were an important part of their overall identity. While they didn't have modern hairstyling products, they did have tools like wooden combs and brushes made from bone, wood, or antlers to keep their hair and beards neat. The Vikings also valued cleanliness to some extent, as they considered it a sign of strength and vitality. However, the absence of proper tools and cleaning products meant that their efforts to stay clean were limited, and despite the fact that they may have taken regular baths, their hygiene practices still left much to be desired. When we look at Viking bathing through the lens of modern hygiene, it becomes clear that their methods were rudimentary at best. Their steam baths were helpful in terms of providing a regular opportunity for the Vikings to sweat and cleanse their bodies. But these baths were far from the hygienic experiences we expect today. The lack of soap, water sanitation, and proper cleaning protocols meant that their baths were more about social interaction and basic body maintenance than true cleanliness. Although Vikings may have bathed more frequently than other cultures at the time, their approach to hygiene was still lacking, and they were far from the well-groomed, hygienic individuals we imagine today. Despite their achievements as fierce warriors and explorers, the Vikings had to make do with the resources available to them, and their personal hygiene practices reflected the tough and challenging environment in which they lived. In conclusion, while the Vikings might have been ahead of their time in terms of bathing habits, their hygiene practices were far from the standards we have today. The lack of modern cleaning products, sanitation systems, and running water made it difficult for them to achieve the kind of cleanliness we now take for granted. So while their steam baths may have been better than nothing, they were still a far cry from the effective hygiene routines that we use today. The Vikings' approach to bathing was an important part of their culture, but their lack of soap, clean water, and proper sanitation meant that they were often left with little more than a sweaty, grimy feeling after their baths. Despite their impressive accomplishments as warriors and explorers, the Vikings' hygiene was ultimately constrained by the limitations of their time. And here's the big one: body odor. The Vikings didn't have deodorants or antiperspirants, so naturally they would have smelled pretty bad after a long day of fighting or sailing. In fact, they didn't even have soap, so they couldn't scrub off the dirt and sweat like we can today. Now, this might seem hard to imagine for those of us who are accustomed to regular showers and modern hygiene products, but for the Vikings, body odor wasn't something that could be easily avoided. In their harsh, physically demanding world, staying clean wasn't always possible, and the lack of modern hygiene products meant that their bodies would have accumulated the kinds of smells that we would find unbearable today. So what did the Vikings do about this? Well, like many other ancient peoples, they used a variety of methods to try and cover up or mask their body odor, but none of these methods were particularly effective. Let's take a deep dive into what the Vikings did or didn't do when it came to managing body odor. To start with, let's consider the Viking lifestyle. These were people who lived in a world without the modern conveniences we now take for granted. There were no showers, no deodorants, no air conditioned homes, and certainly no quick fixes for body odor. The Vikings spent much of their time on the move, either sailing the seas on long voyages, fighting in battles, or living in small, often crowded homes. These conditions made it incredibly difficult to maintain the kind of hygiene that we would expect today. As a result, body odor was likely a constant part of daily life for the Vikings. After all, without the ability to wash away sweat, dirt, and other bodily fluids, it's safe to assume that their bodies would have accumulated a fair amount of odor over time. The Vikings didn't have access to soap or any kind of modern cleaning products, so washing off the dirt and grime that built up on their skin was nearly impossible. Soap, as we know it, wasn't invented yet. Instead, the Vikings had to make do with whatever resources they had on hand. They might have used natural substances like herbs or ash from the fire to scrub their bodies, but these methods were not as effective as modern soap in breaking down oils and dirt. Without the ability to wash their bodies properly, the Vikings would have been left with layers of sweat, oils, and dirt on their skin, all of which contributed to their body odor. Imagine spending days on end in cold, damp conditions, or sweating through a battle, only to have no way to wash off the dirt and sweat afterward. The result would have been a pungent combination of body odor, grime, and sweat, which would have been hard to get rid of, no matter what. So, how did the Vikings try to manage this? Well, they weren't completely ignorant of the issue. They were resourceful people, and they found ways to try and mask the smell, even if they couldn't eliminate it completely. One of the most common methods they used to cover up their body odor was the use of herbs, plants, and perfumes. Vikings likely used various herbs, such as lavender, thyme, and mint, which have strong scents that could mask the more unpleasant odors. These herbs might have been rubbed onto the skin or placed in their clothing to help cover up the smell. In addition, Vikings might have used oils or perfumes made from local plants and flowers. These perfumes, while somewhat effective at masking body odor, were not a substitute for true cleanliness. They could only go so far in covering up the natural smells that came from a body that hadn't been properly washed in weeks. But let's be real, no amount of herbs, flowers, or perfumes would have fully covered up the stench of a Viking who hadn't bathed in weeks. After all, masking the smell is not the same as eliminating it. The more time passed without a proper bath, the stronger the smell would become. And considering the Vikings' physically demanding lives, spending long days in battle, working in fields, or sailing across the seas, their bodies would have produced an overwhelming amount of sweat and odor. The human body produces sweat as a way of cooling itself down, but sweat by itself doesn't have a strong odor. It's the bacteria on our skin that break down the sweat and produce the distinctive smell that we associate with body odor. The Vikings, without access to soap, water, or deodorants, would have been fighting a constant battle against bacteria buildup, leading to a stench that no herbs or perfumes could fully mask. Another factor that contributed to the Vikings' body odor was the climate in which they lived. The Vikings primarily lived in Scandinavia, a region known for its cold, wet weather. The cold temperatures, while they may have made the Vikings' clothing heavier and more difficult to wear, didn't necessarily stop the body from sweating. In fact, the Vikings likely had to wear layers of clothing to protect themselves from the cold, which would have made it difficult for their skin to breathe. As a result, their sweat would have been trapped by their clothing, adding to the overall smell. Even in cold climates, people sweat, especially after physical exertion. And in the case of the Vikings, that physical exertion was often intense, whether they were sailing long distances, fighting in battles, or working the land. While the Vikings might have had ways to stay warm in the cold, they had few ways to stay clean or dry. Adding to the problem, the Vikings often lived in close quarters. Their homes were small, often shared with livestock and animals, and didn't have the luxury of modern ventilation systems. The air inside Viking homes would have been thick with the smell of cooking food, burning wood, and of course, body odor. With little fresh air and no proper means of cleaning or sanitizing the living space, the smell inside these homes would have become suffocating. Add in the fact that Vikings didn't bathe regularly, and it's easy to see how body odor could have become a pervasive issue within Viking society. The Vikings weren't the only ones facing hygiene challenges during this time. Across Europe, many cultures didn't have the regular bathing habits that we take for granted today. In fact, public baths were common in Roman society, but after the fall of the Roman Empire, bathing became less of a cultural norm. The medieval period, including the Viking Age, was known for a lack of focus on personal hygiene. It wasn't unusual for people to go long periods without bathing. In this context, the Vikings weren't necessarily more unclean than their contemporaries. They just had fewer ways of addressing body odor than we do today. But while body odor was a part of daily life for the Vikings, it was not something that was likely talked about in the same way we might discuss it today. Hygiene practices during the Viking Age were shaped by survival rather than comfort. Personal cleanliness wasn't prioritized the way it is in modern societies, where products like deodorant are a part of everyday routines. For the Vikings, staying alive and maintaining strength for battle and survival were far more important than smelling fresh or wearing clean clothes. In fact, body odor was probably just another natural aspect of life, something that came with the physical demands of their existence. So while the Vikings may have done their best to mask their body odor with herbs, perfumes, and other rudimentary methods, it's safe to say that they weren't able to completely eliminate it. In fact, the idea of freshness, as we know, it was simply not on their radar. Their world was one where comfort and cleanliness were secondary to survival, strength, and endurance. The stench of a Viking after weeks of travel, battle, or hard labor would have been a regular part of their life, one that they likely accepted as inevitable. After all, there was little they could do to truly counteract the natural buildup of sweat, dirt, and bacteria on their bodies. Even so, it's important to note that the Vikings didn't neglect all forms of personal grooming. They may not have had deodorants or the ability to bathe frequently, but they did care about their appearance in other ways. Vikings are known for their pride in their long hair and beards, which were often braided and well kept. They may not have been able to wash their hair regularly, but they certainly took care to comb and maintain it, showing that appearance and personal grooming were still valued in their culture. They also used combs made of wood, bone, and ivory to keep their hair and beards free of tangles and debris. But despite these efforts, the absence of proper hygiene routines meant that their bodies likely still carried the stench of their hard lives. In conclusion, the Vikings, like many ancient cultures, did not have the luxury of deodorants or the ability to bathe regularly. As a result, Body odor would have been a natural and unavoidable part of their lives. Their harsh living conditions, combined with the physical demands of their existence, meant that they had few options for combating the natural smells of sweat and dirt. While they might have used herbs and perfumes to try and mask the smell, these methods were not enough to fully eliminate the body odor that came with their way of life. So, while the Vikings may have been fierce warriors and skilled seafarers, they were also living in a world where body odor was simply a fact of life, something they had to accept, even if they couldn't do much to address it. Now, what about their teeth? Well, Viking dental care was, let's just say, non existent. They didn't have toothbrushes, toothpaste, or even the simple tools we use to keep our teeth clean today. We live in a time where dental hygiene is an essential part of our daily routine. From electric toothbrushes to flossing and mouthwash, modern dentistry has come a long way in terms of oral care. However, the Vikings, living over 1,000 years ago, didn't have access to any of these advancements. Instead, they relied on very basic and often ineffective methods to maintain their dental hygiene, leading to a variety of dental problems that are quite different from what we deal with today. The Vikings didn't have toothbrushes as we know them today. In fact, they didn't even have anything close to the elaborate dental tools we use to care for our teeth. Instead, their dental care regimen, if it can even be called that, consisted of primitive methods that would seem almost comical in comparison to modern brushing. One of the methods they used involved chewing on twigs from trees. Certain twigs, like those from the birch tree, were used to clean between the teeth, much like how we might use a toothpick today. However, while chewing on twigs may have helped remove a few bits of food from between the teeth, it was hardly an effective way to fight plaque buildup or prevent tooth decay. While twigs might have helped clear debris from the teeth, they certainly didn't do much to maintain overall oral health. Without the aid of toothpaste, the Vikings couldn't effectively remove the bacteria that build up on teeth throughout the day. We know today that plaque can harden into tartar, which can lead to cavities and gum disease if not cleaned regularly. In Viking times, the lack of proper oral hygiene meant that these dental issues likely went unaddressed, and it's easy to imagine that many Vikings suffered from a variety of dental problems, from toothaches to full-blown tooth loss. Without the fluoride and other elements in modern toothpaste that help protect teeth, the Vikings' teeth would have been vulnerable to decay, and the natural wear and tear from their tough diets certainly didn't help either. The Vikings had a diet that was rough on their teeth. Much of their food came from hard grains, meats, and salted fish, which could be tough to chew and often contained gritty particles that could wear down the enamel of their teeth. Their diet, while providing the necessary nutrients for a life of physical labor and battle, didn't offer the kind of soft, tooth-friendly foods we might enjoy today. Soft bread, fruits, and vegetables were not as readily available, and without the convenience of modern food preservation, their diet was often based on salted or dried meats, which would have been especially hard on their teeth. The act of chewing tough, dry food over a long period of time would gradually wear down the enamel, making teeth more vulnerable to decay. In addition to their tough diet, the Vikings also had limited access to clean water. Today, we take for granted the fact that most of us can easily brush our teeth with clean water, which helps remove food particles and bacteria from our mouths. However, the Vikings didn't have this luxury. Their water sources were often from rivers, lakes, or wells, which could be contaminated with bacteria or debris. The lack of clean water made it harder for the Vikings to properly rinse their mouths after eating, which meant that food particles and bacteria would linger on their teeth longer, increasing the likelihood of plaque buildup and tooth decay. In addition, without modern plumbing or sanitation systems, Viking settlements didn't have the infrastructure to ensure access to fresh water for drinking or rinsing, further compounding the problem. The Vikings also didn't have the knowledge of oral health that we have today. We know now that brushing twice a day, flossing, and visiting a dentist regularly were all key practices for maintaining good oral health. Unfortunately, the Vikings didn't have any of these practices, and the idea of a dental checkup simply didn't exist. Even if they were aware of dental pain or issues like cavities, there were no trained professionals to help them address these problems. Viking societies didn't have dentists, and people likely had to endure toothaches, broken teeth, and abscesses without any modern treatments to relieve the pain. The lack of professional dental care would have meant that many Vikings suffered in silence with dental issues that could have been treated today with simple procedures. In addition to the wear and tear caused by their diet, the Vikings' teeth also suffered from the stress of their lifestyle. The Viking life was physically demanding, and their teeth were put to the test every day. Whether they were chewing on tough meats, crunching through bones, or engaging in battle, their teeth were constantly exposed to wear. Vikings also engaged in frequent physical labor, from farming and building to sailing and fighting, which could result in an increased risk of tooth damage. Since the Vikings didn't have the ability to replace damaged teeth with modern dentistry, the loss of teeth would have been a common issue. In fact, it's likely that many Vikings had missing teeth by the time they reached adulthood, especially given the constant pressure their teeth were under and the lack of effective care. To make matters worse, Viking warriors often didn't have the time or the resources to care for their teeth properly. They spent long periods away from home, either on raids, sea voyages, or military campaigns, and had little opportunity to worry about their dental hygiene. Their primary focus was survival, and dental care was likely not a priority. In the midst of a battle, or while sailing across the seas, there was little chance to stop and floss or brush their teeth. Even if they had the materials to do so, the physical demands of their lives meant that their teeth were subjected to rough conditions with little opportunity for proper care. It's also worth considering the overall state of health in Viking society. In addition to their dental issues, the Vikings likely suffered from other health problems that compounded their dental struggles. Poor nutrition, a harsh living environment, and the constant stress of battle could weaken the immune system and make it harder for the body to fight infections, including those that affected the teeth and gums. While modern medicine and dentistry have given us the tools to prevent and treat dental issues, the Vikings had to contend with the limitations of their time. As a result, many Vikings likely faced a lifetime of dental discomfort, with damaged teeth and gums affecting their open. So in the end, while the Vikings were legendary warriors, their hygiene habits were far from perfect. When we think of the Vikings, we tend to picture powerful warriors, skilled shipbuilders, and fearless explorers. They are celebrated for their bravery and the incredible feats they achieved, like raiding distant lands, discovering new territories, and establishing the Viking Age as one of the most iconic periods of history. However, amid all their strength and valor, the Vikings had some aspects of their daily life that were, to put it simply, far less glamorous chief among them their hygiene practices. These warriors didn't have access to the kind of cleanliness standards that we take for granted today, and their methods for staying clean were far more rudimentary than what we might imagine. When it comes to personal hygiene, it's easy to look at ancient cultures and assume they were all dirty or unkempt, but the Vikings were in fact more hygienic than many other groups of people at the time. They bathed more frequently than many medieval Europeans, who often went weeks, months, or even longer without taking a proper bath. The Vikings were known to bathe at least once a week, a relatively advanced practice compared to other cultures, where bathing was either a rare event or seen as a luxury reserved for the wealthy. However, this level of hygiene was still far from what we consider acceptable today. The Vikings didn't have soap, deodorant, or the specialized hygiene products that we now take for granted. Their bathing routines involved communal steam baths or saunas, where they would gather to sweat out impurities, but even these methods were far from perfect. Without proper sanitation or modern cleaning products, these baths were often filled with sweat, dirt, and grime, and the water wasn't necessarily changed after each use, meaning the Viking bathhouse might not have been as clean as we would expect. They also didn't have toothpaste or toothbrushes. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of walking into a store to buy a toothbrush and a tube of toothpaste. Their methods for dental care were primitive at best. They used simple tools like chewing twigs or rough toothpicks to try to clean their teeth, but this was not nearly as effective as our modern-day brushing routines. Without toothpaste, fluoride, or regular dental checkups, many Vikings likely suffered from tooth decay, cavities, and even tooth loss. If they lived today, they might be astounded by the amount of attention we give to brushing our teeth twice a day and the various dental products available to ensure a healthy smile. Now let's not forget about deodorants, which are essential to modern life. The Vikings didn't have access to the deodorants and antiperspirants that we use to keep body odor at bay. While they might have used herbs, oils, or perfumes to try to mask body odor, they didn't have the convenience of deodorant sticks or sprays that many of us rely on to stay fresh throughout the day. The Vikings, especially after long battles or voyages, would have been covered in sweat and dirt, and the absence of regular baths or showers meant that body odor would have been a persistent issue. The idea of smelling fresh every day was simply not a priority for the Vikings. They had far more pressing concerns on their minds, like raiding distant lands, battling their enemies, and navigating the seas in harsh conditions. Their hygiene practices were adapted to their environment and lifestyle, where survival and conquest were far more important than personal cleanliness. It's easy for us to look back on the Vikings and romanticize their lives, imagining them as these larger-than-life figures who were constantly on the move, exploring new lands, and living by their warrior code. However, the reality was that their day-to-day lives were tough and gritty. Their environments were harsh, and the physical demands of their work, sailing long distances, fighting in battles, and farming, meant that personal hygiene had to take a back seat. They didn't have the comforts of modern life, and personal care was often sacrificed for more urgent matters like staying warm, finding food, and maintaining their strength for battle. Hygiene, as we know it today, was simply not a priority. The Vikings were too focused on surviving in a hostile world where they had to fight for everything, from land to resources. In addition, the Vikings didn't have access to the modern infrastructure that makes hygiene relatively easy for us today. They didn't have running water, indoor plumbing, or sanitation systems. They had to gather water from rivers or wells, which were often miles away from their homes. Bathing in cold water was far from comfortable, especially in the freezing temperatures of Scandinavia. The Vikings were accustomed to roughing it, and the lack of access to clean water meant that even washing their hands or faces could be a difficult task. Water was precious, and it had to be used sparingly. So even if they wanted to stay clean, they had limited access to the resources needed to do so. This made hygiene a far more challenging endeavor than it is today, where we can easily turn on a tap and wash away the dirt and sweat of the day. For the Vikings, hygiene was not about luxury or self-care. It was a matter of practicality. In a world where survival was paramount, they had bigger things to worry about, like raiding villages, defending their lands, and navigating the rough seas. They didn't have the luxury of focusing on their appearances or spending time in a warm, relaxing bath. Instead, their focus was on achieving their goals, whether it was conquering new territories, trading with other cultures, or preparing for the next battle. Personal hygiene was simply not a high priority for them. In fact, it was something they only addressed when absolutely necessary. This is why their bathing practices were more about getting rid of the worst of the dirt and grime, rather than the thorough cleansing experience we expect today. We can romanticize the Viking image all we want, but the truth is, their lives were far more pragmatic and focused on survival than we tend to realize. It's easy to imagine them as these perfect, clean warriors, especially because modern media tends to glorify their image. However, if the Vikings were alive today, they would probably be surprised by how much emphasis we place on personal cleanliness. They might be shocked by the fact that we have specific routines to clean every part of our bodies, brushing our teeth, washing our hair, showering daily, and using deodorants to stay fresh throughout the day. For the Vikings, these things were not priorities. Their life was much more about practical survival, fighting off invaders, ensuring their crops were harvested, and preparing for the next long journey. Hygiene simply didn't have the same importance in their world as it does in ours today. That's not to say the Vikings didn't try to keep themselves as clean as possible under the circumstances. They did, in fact, have some basic methods of personal care, like using wooden combs to untangle their hair or applying herbs to mask body odor. They had to make do with what was available to them. While these methods might seem primitive by modern standards, they were practical given the harsh conditions they lived in. The Vikings were able to adapt and make the best of their situation, prioritizing the essentials for survival. They understood the importance of strength, resilience, and endurance, and their focus was on conquering, exploring, and thriving in a brutal world, rather than worrying about keeping clean in the way we do today. Imagine a Viking warrior stepping into our world today. He might be bewildered by the variety of hygiene products on the shelves of every store, from body washes to shampoo, deodorants, and mouthwashes. He'd likely be amazed by the concept of daily showers, or even the idea that someone would take time out of their day specifically for grooming. Personal care products would likely seem like a luxury he couldn't have fathomed in his world of raiding, sailing, and living in harsh conditions. While we may view hygiene as a fundamental part of life, the Vikings had to focus their energy on surviving and thriving in a world where hygiene was something that could only be addressed when the circumstances allowed for it. At the end of the day, the Vikings were warriors, not groomers. They didn't have the resources, infrastructure, or time to devote to personal hygiene the way we do. Their world was one of constant movement and uncertainty, where battle and survival were the priorities, not keeping their hair clean or brushing their teeth. So while we might look back and laugh at the idea of Vikings being smelly or grimy, we have to understand that their hygiene practices were simply a reflection of the world they lived in. They had bigger things to worry about, like raiding, navigating treacherous seas, and ensuring their place in history. Hygiene, as we know it, was a distant concern. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more historical content. Catch you next time. You might be wondering, how did Viking hygiene compare to other cultures at the time? Well, they were actually better off than many people in medieval Europe who didn't bathe at all. However, compared to other ancient cultures, like the Romans, who had public baths and some form of personal hygiene, the Vikings were a bit behind. While the Romans were obsessed with cleanliness, the Vikings took a more laid-back approach to hygiene, focused on survival and conquest rather than keeping clean. In fact, when we think of ancient cultures and their approaches to hygiene, it's fascinating to see how the Vikings fit into a larger historical context of personal care, where cleanliness and bathing were often not prioritized the way they are today. To start, let's consider the Vikings in comparison to their European neighbors, particularly during the medieval period. Many people in medieval Europe had very little access to bathing facilities. Public bathhouses, where available, were not commonly used by the general population. In fact, bathhouses began to fall out of favor after the fall of the Roman Empire. The early Middle Ages saw a cultural shift away from public bathing, in part due to the spread of disease and the rise of Christianity, which frowned upon some public bathhouse practices. In many cases, bathing was considered a luxury or even a sinful indulgence, and many people went weeks, months, or even years without a bath. In this context, the Vikings were actually better off. While they may not have had the sophisticated bathing systems of ancient Rome, they did bathe more frequently than their medieval European counterparts. Vikings were known to bathe at least once a week, which was more frequent than the bathing habits of many other Europeans during the same time period. Viking bathing practices, though, were far more rudimentary than what we see in cultures like the Romans. The Romans were obsessed with cleanliness, and their obsession with personal hygiene was reflected in their culture and technology. Public baths were widespread throughout the Roman Empire, and these bathhouses were used for more than just cleaning the body. They were also social spaces. Romans would spend hours in public bathhouses, moving through hot rooms, cold plunge pools, and steam rooms, scrubbing their bodies with oils and scrapers to remove dirt and dead skin. The baths were meticulously maintained, with systems for heating water, drainage, and cleaning that were far ahead of their time. Public bathhouses were accessible to most people, not just the elite, and bathing was a regular part of Roman life. Romans even had specialized slaves called strigils who would scrape the oil and dirt from their bodies. To the Romans, bathing was not just a necessity for hygiene, but also a form of leisure and self-care. This focus on cleanliness made the Romans a stark contrast to the Vikings, whose bathing practices were much more basic and less frequent. The Vikings didn't have anything like the elaborate Roman bathhouses. Instead, they relied on steam baths or saunas, which were far simpler and less effective than the Roman systems. Viking baths were usually communal, where people would gather to sweat it out in a hot, steamy room. While this method of bathing was more regular than in many parts of medieval Europe, It was still a far cry from the carefully constructed Roman baths. Viking steam baths were not particularly hygienic by modern standards, as they didn't have any system for draining or cleaning the water between uses. In fact, they likely became dirty quickly, with sweat, dirt, and oils from multiple bathers mixing into the water. And while the Vikings might have used herbs or ash to clean their skin or deodorize, it wasn't nearly as effective as the scrubbing and cleansing techniques used by the Romans. So, while Viking hygiene was certainly ahead of many European cultures in terms of frequency, it was still nowhere near the level of sophistication seen in Roman society. However, the Vikings' lack of focus on bathing wasn't necessarily due to ignorance or neglect. It was more about their priorities. The Vikings lived in a world where survival, conquest, and exploration were of far greater importance than personal hygiene. They were a warrior society, constantly moving between raids, voyages, and battles, where time for bathing simply didn't exist. In contrast to the Romans, who had the luxury of time and resources to dedicate to cleanliness, the Vikings were preoccupied with war and expansion. Personal care, including hygiene, was not a daily concern for them. They had no time to spend in public baths or dedicate entire afternoons to personal grooming. For them, life was about fighting, sailing, and building, with hygiene being an afterthought. As a result, their approach to hygiene was much more pragmatic, focusing on the most basic necessities to maintain some level of cleanliness, but not going beyond that. One of the main reasons hygiene wasn't prioritized by the Vikings was the sheer physical demands of their lifestyle. These were people who spent their days raiding, farming, building, and sailing. They didn't have the luxury of stepping into a warm bath after a long day. Instead, they lived in harsh conditions and often didn't have access to water or bathing facilities. In many cases, their days were filled with strenuous physical activity, meaning that after a long day of sailing or fighting, the focus was on survival, food, and rest, not on cleanliness. Even if they wanted to stay clean, the resources available to them were limited. Fresh water was not always readily available, and the freezing temperatures of their Scandinavian homeland meant that a cold bath or shower was not even an option. When water could be found, it was often difficult to transport back to their homes, and without plumbing or indoor baths, the Vikings had little choice but to make do with what they had. So despite the fact that they might have wanted to maintain their hygiene, the Vikings' way of life simply didn't allow for the luxury of frequent bathing or access to clean water. In addition to these practical challenges, the Viking approach to hygiene also reflected their cultural values. For the Vikings, cleanliness was not a sign of wealth or status, as it was for the Romans. Instead, they valued strength, resilience, and the ability to endure hardship. While the Romans placed great importance on personal grooming and cleanliness as a reflection of their sophisticated society, the Vikings took a more utilitarian approach to life. Their culture was based around their ability to fight, explore, and survive, not on personal appearance or cleanliness. In Viking society, appearance mattered, but it was more about practicality than vanity. A Viking's physical appearance was often tied to their identity as a warrior. Long hair, a thick beard, and a rugged look were symbols of strength and endurance. Hygiene, on the other hand, was not a key part of their identity. For the Vikings, the focus was on surviving the elements, living in harsh conditions, and preparing for battle, not on maintaining a polished appearance. As a result, their grooming habits were relatively basic, and cleanliness was something that was only addressed when absolutely necessary. When we think of ancient cultures, it's easy to assume that hygiene was something that was universally important to all societies. After all, we live in an era where hygiene is often considered a reflection of one's social standing. However, in the Viking Age, the emphasis was on survival and practical living rather than personal cleanliness. While cultures like the Romans were obsessed with cleanliness, the Vikings had more pressing concerns. They didn't have the luxury of public bathhouses, running water, or the time to dedicate to personal care. In many ways, their hygiene practices were dictated by their environment, lifestyle, and culture. Living in a harsh climate, constantly on the move, and focused on survival, the Vikings simply didn't have the same focus on personal care as the Romans or other ancient cultures. Despite their lack of focus on hygiene, the Vikings were by no means completely neglectful of their appearance. As previously mentioned, their long hair and beards were an important part of their identity as warriors. Viking men, in particular, were known for their well maintained hair and facial hair, which were often braided or styled to reflect their strength and status within their community. Viking women also took pride in their appearance, often braiding their hair or wearing it in elaborate styles. However, these grooming practices were more about identity and culture than they were about hygiene. The grooming tools used by the Vikings, wooden combs and bone needles, were designed for maintenance, not for cleaning or sanitizing. These tools helped keep their hair and beards in check, but didn't have the same hygienic purposes as the combs and brushes we use today. Ultimately, Viking hygiene was about doing the best they could with the resources they had. They were far more concerned with staying alive, protecting their communities, and expanding their territories than they were about cleanliness. While their hygiene practices were more advanced than those of some other cultures at the time, they were still far from the sophisticated systems seen in ancient Rome. The Vikings had to prioritize their survival in a world that was harsh, unpredictable, and constantly changing. In this context, cleanliness was not a luxury they could afford, and their approach to hygiene reflected this harsh reality. They focused on the basics: sweat baths, combing their hair, and maintaining their beards, rather than the more elaborate and frequent bathing practices seen in Roman society. So while we may think of the Vikings as fierce and mighty warriors, their approach to hygiene was much more utilitarian than what we're used to today. Compared to the Romans, the Vikings were behind in terms of personal cleanliness, but they were certainly more hygienic than many of their contemporaries in medieval Europe. Their lifestyle, focused on survival and conquest, simply didn't leave much room for the daily rituals of cleanliness and grooming that were commonplace in Roman society. For the Vikings, survival was the goal, and cleanliness was something to be managed when possible, but not prioritized over more pressing needs. Speaking of conditions, let's talk about where the Vikings lived. Most of them lived in small, simple wooden homes, often shared with livestock, in harsh climates. The typical Viking house was not the spacious, comfortable dwelling we think of today. These homes were humble, constructed using materials that were readily available in the harsh Scandinavian environment, primarily wood, stone, and thatch. The houses were often built to withstand the extreme cold and the constant wet weather. However, the conditions within these homes weren't exactly conducive to cleanliness. In fact, living conditions for the Vikings were far from the hygienic standards we have in modern times. There wasn't much access to running water or any kind of sanitation systems like we have today. This meant that even if they wanted to stay clean, they didn't have many options. Water had to be gathered from rivers or wells, and washing clothes and linens was a laborious task. Hygiene, as we know it, simply wasn't possible for them. The reality was that personal care took a back seat to survival in everyday life, as the Vikings focused their energy on what was essential for their survival: warmth, food, shelter, and protection. Viking homes were typically longhouses, which were shared by families, animals, and often servants or slaves. The longhouse was designed to maximize space in a cold northern climate, with a central hearth for warmth and cooking, and rooms on either side for sleeping and living. The floor was often made of dirt or stone, and the ceilings were low, which meant there wasn't much room for ventilation or airflow. With no chimneys, smoke from the hearth would fill the home, making it smoky and difficult to keep clean. The lack of ventilation, combined with the cold and dampness outside, created a perfect environment for the buildup of grime and dust inside. The presence of animals, cattle, sheep, and pigs inside the homes only added to the situation. Not only did the animals produce waste, but their presence created more dirt and germs that would have been hard to manage without the proper facilities to clean. The Vikings were used to living in close quarters with their livestock because it provided warmth in the harsh winter months. The body heat from the animals helped keep the longhouse warmer, making the living conditions a little more tolerable during the cold Scandinavian winters. However, it also meant that their living environment was far from hygienic. The animals would have contributed to the odor, and their waste would have likely accumulated on the floor, making it difficult to maintain cleanliness. Given the structure of Viking homes, there was little room for privacy or personal space. Families were often crammed together in a single room, which had limited space for sleeping or storing personal items. The lack of privacy also meant that maintaining hygiene was nearly impossible. In these crowded conditions, personal cleanliness would have been a challenge, and with no designated bathrooms, the Vikings had to relieve themselves in areas outside of the house. However, sanitation was minimal at best, with few opportunities to dispose of waste in a clean and controlled manner. The Vikings, like many ancient peoples, had to make do with what they had, which meant that their living conditions were far from comfortable or sanitary by today's standards. As a result, hygiene was likely a low priority, and even if the Vikings wanted to stay clean, they would have faced significant challenges. One of the main difficulties was the lack of access to running water, which we take for granted today. The Vikings didn't have indoor plumbing, so water had to be collected from nearby rivers or wells, which were often far from their homes. Carrying water from these sources to the house was a labor-intensive task, and since there was no running water, it meant that the Vikings had to rely on what little water they could gather for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. The water they gathered from rivers and wells wasn't necessarily clean either. In fact, water sources like rivers could be contaminated by bacteria or waste, making it difficult to maintain any kind of sanitary conditions in their homes. This lack of clean water made bathing nearly impossible for the Vikings, and even washing their hands or faces was a challenge. For the most part, Vikings likely washed only when absolutely necessary, as fresh water was a scarce resource that had to be used sparingly. The task of cleaning clothes and linens was another huge challenge for the Vikings. Unlike today, when we can simply toss our dirty laundry into a washing machine and have it cleaned in a matter of hours, the Vikings had to wash their clothes by hand, and it was a time-consuming process. Without soap or detergents, they likely used natural substances like ash, clay, or animal fats to clean their clothes. But even with these primitive methods, cleaning clothes was a laborious task that required both time and effort. Viking clothing, made from wool, leather, and other natural fibers, was often heavy and designed to withstand the harsh environment. This clothing didn't breathe well, so the Vikings would have likely been stuck wearing the same clothes for long periods, which would have accumulated sweat, dirt, and odor. Without a way to properly wash their clothing, they were essentially left to deal with the effects of living in their own grime. Viking society also lacked the concept of regular bathing as we understand it today. While some cultures in the ancient world had public baths or developed advanced methods of personal hygiene, the Vikings had no such luxury. There were no public bathhouses or dedicated spaces for cleaning. The Vikings may have used communal steam baths or saunas as a way to sweat out dirt, but these were hardly effective in terms of cleanliness. These steam baths were shared by many people at once, and they lacked the modern sanitation systems necessary to keep the space clean. Bathing was not an everyday routine for the Vikings. It was more of a ritual that was likely done when the opportunity arose, not as a regular part of their lives. Without soap or other cleaning agents, the Vikings likely left these communal baths feeling only slightly cleaner, but still covered in sweat, dirt, and oils from their skin. The lack of consistent bathing meant that personal hygiene was much more difficult to maintain. The lack of proper sanitation didn't just affect their personal cleanliness, it had serious health implications. The buildup of waste, the constant exposure to germs, and the lack of clean drinking water meant that diseases could spread quickly among the Vikings. In fact, many of the health problems that plagued Viking society likely had to do with unsanitary conditions. Without access to modern medical care or knowledge of disease prevention, the Vikings were vulnerable to a variety of illnesses that spread through unsanitary conditions. Infections could easily take root in the Viking population, and with limited access to health care, many would have suffered from diseases that were impossible to treat. Without the kind of healthcare systems or knowledge of hygiene that we now have, the Vikings were at constant risk of illness, and the poor sanitation in their homes only made these health risks worse. Living in these conditions, it's clear that hygiene was not a priority for the Vikings. Their focus was on survival and providing for their families, not on keeping their homes spotless or ensuring their personal cleanliness. The harsh environments they lived in, the lack of proper sanitation systems, and the constant physical labor they engaged in meant that hygiene took a back seat to more pressing concerns. While they may have done their best to stay clean, given the circumstances, it was nearly impossible for them to achieve the standards of cleanliness that we now expect. They had to work with the resources available to them, and those resources were limited. In a world where survival was the top priority, cleanliness was simply not something that could be prioritized. This lack of hygiene wasn't just a result of laziness or negligence, it was the reality of living in a world that was vastly different from our own. The Vikings were not lazy or dirty people. They were survivors, warriors, and explorers who had to adapt to their harsh environment and make the best of what they had. Their way of life required constant physical labor, travel, and battle, leaving little room for personal care or cleanliness. Hygiene, as we know it, simply wasn't possible for them given the challenges they faced. They made do with what they could, but maintaining cleanliness was always secondary to their need for survival. In fact, most of what we now consider essential for personal hygiene, running water, soap, a way to properly clean and sanitize clothes, simply didn't exist for the Vikings. So while it might seem strange to think of Vikings living in such unhygienic conditions, it's important to understand that their reality was very different from ours. The lack of modern amenities, like running water, sanitation systems, and cleaning products, meant that hygiene was a constant challenge for the Vikings. They lived in small, overcrowded homes with minimal access to fresh water, and their clothing and bedding were difficult to clean. Without proper sanitation or bathing routines, their bodies and homes became breeding grounds for dirt and disease. Yet, in spite of these challenges, the Vikings were able to accomplish incredible feats, from exploring new lands to building powerful kingdoms. Their lives were hard, but they adapted to their environment in ways that allowed them to survive and thrive. Hygiene might not have been a priority for them, but their ability to endure and succeed in such difficult conditions is a testament to their strength, resilience, and ingenuity. Let's not forget that the Vikings spent a lot of time at war, on the move, or on long sea voyages. When you're fighting battles or navigating rough seas, personal hygiene is usually the last thing on your mind. You're more focused on survival, strategy, and staying alive in a brutal, unpredictable world. And that's exactly the environment the Vikings lived in, a time when the luxury of a quick shower or a refreshing bath was not a regular part of their lives. Their existence was defined by constant movement and engagement with their harsh surroundings, where survival, not personal care, was the priority. Their daily lives involved challenges that went far beyond cleanliness, and as a result, hygiene wasn't something they could afford to focus on. While we like to think of Vikings as these clean, mighty warriors, the reality was that they were probably covered in grime and sweat most of the time. The life of a Viking was hard, filled with long, exhausting days of physical labor, fighting, and exploring, and in that environment, hygiene was often pushed to the back of the mind. The Vikings were notorious for their seafaring exploits, embarking on long voyages across the open sea. These journeys, which could last months at a time, involved incredible physical endurance and constant battle against the elements. Their ships, known as longships, were fast and maneuverable, designed to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. But despite their remarkable design, these ships weren't equipped with the modern comforts we take for granted today, like fresh water supplies, proper sanitation, or places to wash up after a long day. Instead, the Vikings had to make do with what they had. Water was scarce, and finding places to bathe during long voyages was nearly impossible. Most of the time, they had to rely on the sea for everything, including washing their bodies. However, the salt water of the ocean wasn't exactly an ideal cleaning agent. The constant exposure to seawater would have likely left their skin and hair coated with salt, making it harder to stay clean or fresh. And with no fresh water to wash away the salt, grime, or sweat, Vikings likely spent much of their time on these voyages, feeling grimy and dirty. On these long sea voyages, the Vikings were often confined to their ships, which were crowded with people, supplies, and animals. Space on a longship was limited, and privacy was non existent. You can imagine that after days, weeks, or even months at sea, personal hygiene was not a priority. The conditions on these ships were uncomfortable, and after a long, grueling day of navigating, fighting, or even just sailing through storms, no one was thinking about how they smelled or how dirty their clothes had become. Instead, they were focused on the immediate needs of their journey, like food, water, and staying safe from attacks or navigating through dangerous waters. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for Vikings to sail in stormy weather or face months of rough conditions, which would only add to the discomfort of life on board. The saltwater air, the dampness of the ship, and the lack of personal space made the idea of personal cleanliness nearly impossible. But the lack of hygiene didn't stop with the long voyages. When Vikings weren't sailing, they were often fighting in brutal battles, raiding villages, or protecting their territories. Warfare was a constant part of Viking life, and these warriors were frequently on the move, battling opponents and then quickly packing up and moving again. In these conditions, there was little time to worry about things like showering, washing clothes, or brushing their teeth. Viking warriors often wore layers of armor, shields, and heavy clothing, which after days of battle would be soaked in sweat, blood, and dirt. The idea of a quick break to clean up was a luxury that simply wasn't available to them. Their battles were physically exhausting, and more often than not, lasted long enough to ensure that they'd be left with sweat-drenched, grime-covered bodies by the end of the day. After fighting, most Vikings would have had to retreat to temporary camps or shelters where conditions were no better. The ground was usually cold and muddy, and hygiene wasn't a concern in the middle of a battlefield. With few opportunities to bathe or wash their gear, Viking warriors often found themselves living in their own dirt and sweat for days on end. And then there's the fact that the Vikings didn't have the luxury of modern conveniences like running water or plumbing. In fact, plumbing systems didn't even exist in the Viking Age, and while some civilizations had public baths or developed rudimentary sanitation systems, the Vikings made do with what they could. In their homes, they would have had to rely on natural water sources like nearby rivers or lakes, but these weren't always easily accessible. If they were living in a coastal area, they might have been able to get some fresh water, but this would still be a labor-intensive process. Water would have to be collected in buckets or barrels and carried back to their homes, which was a time-consuming task. In the middle of a long voyage, or during an extended military campaign, however, fresh water wasn't always readily available, so even when they had access to water, they often didn't have enough of it to wash off the day's dirt and grime. Their primary focus was always survival, food, shelter, and safety, leaving little room for cleanliness. This meant that personal hygiene was far down on the list of priorities, and maintaining cleanliness on a regular basis was simply not feasible. In their villages, Vikings might have had access to some kind of bathing facilities, but they were basic at best. They used steam baths or communal bathing areas to cleanse their bodies, but these were not equipped with the hygiene products or sanitation systems we have today. Vikings would bathe in public spaces, often sharing the same water and air as others in their community. These communal baths were designed to help sweat out impurities, but they weren't sanitized, and they lacked the kind of cleanliness standards that we're accustomed to today. The absence of soap, modern cleaning agents, and the lack of proper drainage systems meant that Viking bathhouses were far from hygienic. In fact, after multiple people had used the same bath, the water would likely have become dirty with sweat, oils, and grime from everyone who bathed before. So while Vikings may have bathed more frequently than some of their European neighbors, their bath experiences were likely far from clean by today's standards. This means that they may have left the bath feeling a little bit cleaner, but still covered in sweat, dirt, and bacteria from the communal environment. The absence of regular, thorough washing meant that the Vikings likely lived with a certain level of grime and body odor that was simply a part of their way of life. Moreover, Vikings had to contend with the cold climate of Scandinavia, which presented its own set of challenges when it came to personal hygiene. While many Vikings lived in northern regions, where the winters were long and harsh, they didn't have access to the luxury of hot water on demand. Even if they did have access to a fresh water source, it would have been freezing cold, especially in the winter months. The cold temperatures meant that getting into a body of water to wash off wouldn't have been an appealing option for most people, especially after spending long hours battling the elements. The idea of bathing in cold water or waiting for the rare opportunity to wash would have been an arduous task. Even on the rare occasions when Vikings might have managed to find a freshwater stream or lake, the cold water would have made it difficult to fully cleanse themselves. For many, washing off simply wasn't an option when they were too busy surviving and fighting off the elements. Living in such a physically demanding environment didn't exactly help the Vikings' hygiene situation either. They spent much of their time engaging in hard labor, farming, sailing, and battling. These activities kept them constantly moving, and their clothing and bodies were constantly exposed to the harsh elements. The clothing they wore was made from wool, leather, and other natural materials, which, while effective in keeping them warm, were not breathable and would have trapped sweat against their skin. This only compounded the problem, as wearing layers of clothing in these conditions would have caused them to sweat profusely. Sweat, when it's trapped against the skin, leads to body odor, and without deodorants or antiperspirants, it would have been difficult to keep the smell at bay. The combination of sweat, dirt, and oils from their skin would have left them smelling less than fresh, particularly after days of hard physical work. Even if they managed to get some fresh air in the open, the fact that they didn't have the means to wash regularly meant that body odor was an inevitable part of their daily lives. In the end, the Vikings lived in a world where hygiene wasn't a priority. They were too busy fighting, raiding, and exploring to focus on cleanliness. Their lifestyle, though impressive in many ways, didn't leave much room for regular bathing or other personal hygiene practices. The harsh conditions they lived in, the cold temperatures, and the constant movement from one place to another meant that cleanliness was often sacrificed in favor of survival. While modern conveniences like deodorants, body washes, and the luxury of regular showers may make us think of the Vikings as dirty or grimy, it's important to remember that their way of life didn't afford them the time or resources to focus on personal hygiene. For the Vikings, staying alive and achieving their goals, whether it was raiding, exploring, or building their communities, was the top priority, and hygiene simply had to take a back seat.